Good evening, everyone. How is everyone tonight? Great, wonderful. Welcome to Arena's stage. My name is Renee Littleton. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our first Arena Civil Dialogues of 2020 in the new year. That's pretty exciting. I'm happy to share that this program, created by Professor Amitai Etzioni, has been in wonderful collaboration with Arena Stage, and it is a marvelous opportunity to have lively conversations with individuals and all of us who may have differing opinions on the topics that we're discussing, but the beauty of this program is that we can all come together in one place and be able to do them civilly and be able to have great interactions with one another. So of course, I don't want to keep you from this evening's panel, but please see more of our civil dialogues coming up. We've got some on the program and also on our website. Please follow us online and click and share and tell everyone about this program to come join us. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Etzioni and tonight's panel. Thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Well, thank you very much. This have been indeed now 3 years of very enjoyable and beneficial, productive dialogues working together with Arena and the staff. So thank you for the opportunity to work together. My job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible so you can hear from my very distinguished colleagues. So let me just raise one question, and I was given the right to raise one more later, and then be your turn. So the most elementary, basic, simplistic way to ask the question before us is how big should the government be? And we all know from our high school days that on one end of the spectrum there are people who feel that the government that governs least governs best, that our essential, we are rational, competent people, endowed with rights, who can make our own decision, and the more we are let alone, the better we're all going to be. The liberty essentially means liberty to do our own thing. The government is coercive. And on the other hand, we have, again, start on the most elementary basis. People say that, first of all, in order for that free society to exist, there needs to be a government which will protect property rights, will ensure that none of the corporations in the marketplace will be so large that they control the marketplace, that there be some attention to public goods which the market will not provide for, like basic research, public health, security, and defense, that the market may allocate things efficiently but not justly, and so there surely should be a role in the government. So that's one way of looking at it. I like to put it slightly differently and put it, as they say sometimes, within history. And I think about society as driven like a car which has a very loose steering wheel. And it's keep oversteering to the left, and then we try to correct it, and we oversteer to the right. So if you look at it in history, I was in the Carter White House when Professor Al Khan came from Cornell and said, I found a miracle how to do things, deregulate airlines. Now, again, you have to see the context. At that point, airlines were extremely regulated. Not only they were told exactly where they have to fly, but how much they can charge, and the distance between the seats, what they could serve. It was symbolized by the fact they had something called the sandwich war. What was the sandwich war? Because they were not allowed to make any differences in any other way, they piled things on the sandwiches, like whole meals on top of the sandwiches. Regulation was so close. Whether or not the deregulation of airlines, which followed, was a great success or not, that we could spend a whole other seminar on. But one thing is unmistakable, that a lot of deregulation followed. In the Reagan era, the whole idea was enormous pushback against the Great Society programs, against affirmative action. The President Clinton prided himself, as he said, the age of big government is over. He ended welfare as we knew it. President Obama introduced some regulations, but surely not nearly as many as were slashed. And of course, now we have enormous cutting of regulation. And the question is not only now the abstract question, what is the proper role of government, but where are we in history? Are we at the point where we have too little regulations or too much? Now, of course, there can be some areas, but in general, and if you follow, I find of interest in the last 2 days, several articles coming from the center of where all the CEOs, all the capitalists meet in Davos, Switzerland. The new theme, according to the media, is that the capitalists feel there's too much deregulation, that we may have gone too far. So that's my first question to the panel. What is the role of government, and where are we now within history?
Well, thank you very much for organizing this event, Amitai, and I'm delighted to be here to address precisely those questions because I've spent a lifetime thinking about them, and maybe I will have some things to say that will be useful. With respect to this last point that you made about the corporate people saying there needs to be a little more regulation, that is not uncommon, especially among the Fortune 500 sorts, because it is well known in economic literature that big actors, big corporations, benefit competitively against small entrepreneurs by a substantial degree of regulation because they can address it more efficiently than can the little guy, the mom and pop organization. And so we see this dynamic regularly. And I'm sure that the economists on the panel will have something to say about that. But let me address, to get this started, the larger question you raised about the proper role of government. And I assume we're talking here primarily in the American context, although we could broaden it. And if we are talking primarily about the American context, I served in the Reagan administration, which followed your administration, and as a result, I have a view that is very much reflective of that administration. And I will start with where it seems to me we must start. The proper role of government in the American context is set by the Constitution. And the Constitution sets forth those areas in which the federal government has authority, beyond which its actions are ultra vires or beyond its authority. And then you look at the 10th Amendment and you see that those powers that are not delegated to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So if you want to answer the question, what role of government is proper in the American context, you look at the Constitution. And what you find is that for about 150 years, we lived under largely limited federal government and to a substantial extent limited state government as well. However, there was a great change in 1937 through 1943 in the thinking about the government, and the New Deal court, having been cowed by Franklin Roosevelt's threat to pack the court with 6 new members, essentially turned the Constitution on its head. Is this mic working correctly for me, sir? Good, okay. And as a result, we had a fundamental rethinking of the proper role of government, quite independent of what the Constitution said. And we had the explosion of government that's given us the Leviathan that we know and love so well today. And so there we have a situation now where we have government redistributing and regulating in ways that are not remotely authorized by the Constitution. The result is a debt of approaching 23 trillion. That's trillion, I said, dollars, and no one knows how to get it under control. We keep borrowing, we keep spending, and in other words, we are demanding more government than we're willing to pay for. This is not an American problem alone. You see this in all Western countries. But it is particularly important here to understand the direction we're going, because all we have to do is look at the GAO reports with respect to Social Security and even more with respect to Medicare, and we're going into very parlous affairs with respect to the irresponsibility of the role of the irresponsible course we took with respect to the role of government. And I'll just leave it there and ask my fellow colleagues to pronounce further on these subjects.
Yes, we're going to talk about the United States.
Yes. Oh, do we have an extra microphone?
We have to share. The comment was made that this was the first civil discussion of the 20th of this decade. My fear is it may be the last. I tend to approach this question in a perhaps less legalistic fashion than Roger just characterized. If I were to take my text for the role of government, it would be that of Abraham Lincoln, whose comment, and I'm going to read it, was that we have governments, Lincoln said, to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do it all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. Now, the key point or the key insight that I take away from that comment is that government is an instrument, a tool for solving problems. It's a good tool for solving a lot of problems. It's a lousy tool for solving others. One of the functions that governments have is to establish the conditions for the operation of free markets. And in the United States and most other nations, developed nations in the world today, using markets as the way of making economic decisions is the prevailing way. But the responsibility of government does not stop once it has set a market economy in motion. Markets function very well in some cases. They function fairly well in others, and they fail utterly in dealing with many other issues and problems. When functioning normally, they may result, as they have in the United States, in rapidly growing economic inequality. Many people regard that as a problem. Others do not. I suspect we may be divided 2-2 on the stage today as to whether that is a major economic problem. But for questions such as that, a democracy under the Constitution functions by generating discussions among people regarding how to use the instrumentality of government as a possible solution for that and many other problems. So I find defining the proper role of government, phrased that way, leads for me to an unproductive discussion. I feel much more comfortable if we consider the society in which we live, we consider problems that exist and need to be addressed, and try to find ways of effectively dealing with them. There are cases where the government does too much and makes things worse. We have a policy right now of selling subsidized flood insurance to people who build houses in floodplains. This is insane. It's a waste of money, and it is a good example of the misuse of government. Sometimes we do too little. There weren't enough inspectors of water quality in Flint, Michigan, and so people got sick and died. We need more water quality inspectors with power to prevent those kinds of things from happening. So my answer to the size of government is that we need to choose the size of government appropriate to the problems that we confront, which incidentally, it seems to me, is a sufficient explanation for why the role of government expanded in the face of the Great Depression, a world war, and the assumption by the United States of a leadership position in the world. A whole host of new problems had to be addressed. The government was an instrumentality for trying to address them. I don't want to get in the position of defending every action that the government pursued in the attempt to solve those problems, but for why people wanted, and in the United States got, a larger and more activist government, I would simply say, look around the world and look around our nation.
I wanted to disagree strongly with my two fellow panelists to make it more interesting, but I'm sure we're going to have time for that. I must say, as a preliminary salvo, I'm in general agreement with what Roger and Henry have said. I would answer the question at three levels. One is at the broadest level in an American context. Government exists to meet a mission statement for America as given in the preamble of the Constitution. It's to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. There are 5 other reasons given why we, the American people, are establishing this Constitution. I think this last clause is the most powerful one because it teaches us 2 lessons. One is that we should distinguish liberty from the blessings of liberty, i.e. not all uses of liberty will yield blessings, and as such, they ought not to be encouraged or condoned. And second, it is not just liberty for ourselves, but for our posterity. It's a deeply Burkean statement embedded in the Constitution that America is an intergenerational compact. We are custodians. We must look to the next generation and hand to them a country that is ideally in better shape than the one that we inherited from our forefathers. So that to me is at the macro level what the government should do. If you look at the Constitution at a more granular level, I don't like the question, what should the government do? Because there is no government in the United States Constitution. There is a Congress, an executive, and a judiciary at the federal level. There is no references to a unified federal government in the Constitution. And then you have, well, at the time 13 and now 50 state governments. And the basic logic of the Constitution is, unless the Constitution says that Congress is allowed to do something, it's not allowed to do it. So Congress has jurisdiction over 17 specific areas, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. The states are the very opposite. Unless the Constitution explicitly forbids a state government from doing something, it can do what it wants. So the original design for the Constitution is a pretty limited national government, although there is Article 1, Section 8, the 18th article, the necessary and proper clause, which I'm not going to read the way a progressive would, but I suspect I have a more expansive interpretation than Roger might, and that it gives the government a fair amount of power. But that being said, the original design for America was that the state and then the local governments would do a fair amount. Now, at the third level, I would say, what does this mean for today? I mean, the government we have today, I think no plausible reading of the Constitution can legitimize the government we have today. It has been modified beyond recognition, only in very small part due to amendments. I mean, it mostly is a combination of judicial activism and delegation by Congress to executive agencies. Very broad powers to regulate so that we have a government that doesn't really align with the Constitution. So how should we think about it today? I like your recommendation, Henry, that it's going to vary depending on the issue, and it'll depend on the level of government. I would broadly say that my concerns are, one, preserving the price mechanism in markets. So a simple example would be I believe we should help our fellow Americans who can't afford health care, but that the wiser way to do it is to give them vouchers that allow them to purchase health insurance on a marketplace so that it drives up quality and it drives down prices, rather than move towards what I moved from, the Canadian system of, if any of you want to be de-romanticized about the Canadian system, come talk to me afterwards. I'll share with you my stories. It's not that the American system is perfect, but I guarantee the Canadian one has enormous problems that Americans tend to be blind to. So that would be one. And then second, when government is intervening in civil society, I would want it to do it in such a way that does not undermine work and family. I would want government to strengthen, to buttress civil society, not to weaken it. That being said, I'm well aware that there are parts of America that are quite broken. And I don't think it's enough to say we've had very bad programs with perverse incentives for 50 years that have done a lot of damage to community and to family. Now we're just going to turn them off and you take care of yourselves. I mean, if someone's been stabbed, it's not enough to remove the knife and say, okay, you've now been made whole. And this, I think, is the really, really hard question to which I don't think anyone has a perfect answer, which is, how do you use the rather blunt tools of government to revitalize and strengthen broken civil society?
Talk about a blunt instrument.
That's a fact. That's called dropping the mic.
So we've heard two perspectives, and I think there's an alignment with the first and the third, and Hank's was a different point of view, and I, not surprisingly, would align myself with Henry Aaron's approach to defining the role of government. Although, much as I respect you, Hank, I like aligning myself with Abraham Lincoln better. But, and had he lived longer, we might be facing a different world. But I, too, look at the role of government in terms of the problems, the social issues that we cannot address well as individuals, but need collective action in order to address. I think environmental policy is one of the most obvious of those areas, but that's not the one I work in, so I'm going to focus on one that was raised by other speakers, and that is our social insurance or our health and pension areas of policy, which I think are quite challenging and in which we have a history of some collective action to address those problems. But what I would say when I look at the current environment is that we don't have a robust government in addressing those problems. We have both some a little more robust on the pension side, Social Security, than on the healthcare side, but we don't have a public approach to addressing those needs for the most part. Our programs for addressing those kinds of social concerns are heavily vested in employment and in income. And that reliance on what is a heavily tax-supported system for health insurance and for pensions, although that system has changed dramatically over the years, that system systematically excludes people who are not in good jobs with good benefits. And the social welfare system we built underneath the employment system has systematically excluded working-age adults who are not connected to dependent children. That hole in our system is substantial and leaves a substantial portion of our population without adequate social insurance protections in a society that relies on regulated capitalism, but capitalism to an enormous extent, which has, as we know, significant ups and downs, and many argue that a viable social insurance system is essential to preserve a thriving economy. I would align myself with that point of view and argue that we need a more robust government than we have today in addressing those issues. We have, I would say, a very timid government response to let me just stay with healthcare, to the healthcare issues that we're facing. And there is a raging debate among Democrats as to where we should go in the future. given my own experience in promoting expanded health insurance coverage, going back to the Clinton administration and before, and working with the Obama administration, I do not think it is easy to shift a system entirely onto the taxpayer, but I am delighted to see activism that supports a government role that is not afraid of addressing the issues and finding the best way we can and the politically most viable way we can to address them.
Well, thank you very much. I was given a new microphone, so I have no idea what you heard before when I had the old microphone. But let me just say, one of the questions I raised was if we have, that we need to see things in history, and things which at some period we may have had too much regulation. The question I asked if we now may have too little regulation. And I want for 30 seconds to take off my moderator hat and tell you about an experiment I did recently in trying to get some insight into that question for myself. So what I did, with the help of my assistant, I did listed on a piece of paper all our major industries. And then I closed my eyes at random and picked one up to see if that industry was under or over-regulated. So I first came to pharmacy with shipping 1 billion addictive pills after the industry knew that they're killing a lot of people, where a corporation increased prices by 5,000%, not reporting to the government, killing and such. I said, well, that's one rotten apple in the barrel. I picked up the next industry, that was colleges for profit. And, well, do I have to finish the sentence? They turn out to sell degrees, settle students with enormous debt. Then I close my eyes and pick out the banks, and I read about Wells Fargo creating 1 million. Anyhow, I haven't found a healthy apple in the barrel yet. So my conclusion is, that's not the motto, that's one opinion, that we do need a little more regulation, that capitalism thrives best when it's well regulated. Now, we agreed earlier that we're going to have one more round on a different question. And that is, so far we talked about the marketplace, but those of you who follow this conversation know, very often we have the line that the same people who want the government out of the marketplace want the government in our bedroom. That there's a whole list of social issues, abortion, divorce, sex education, and such, on marriage, on which some people feel very strongly the government should have a very active role. So I'm going to one more time ask the panel to weigh in on what should be the role of the government in the so-called cultural issues, which is really a very unfortunate term. We really talk about moral value issues. And David agreed to take the lead here, and then the rest of the panel will follow.
I am. Yeah. With all due respect, I don't like the way the question is posed. Because when you talk about social, cultural issues and the bedroom, it's obviously already rigged in a certain way. Why the hell is the government in the bedroom? I prefer to think of all these examples you gave, they're not social issues, they're not cultural issues, they're posterity issues. All of them have to do with the family, which is the unit that generates life, and the children and the conditions under which they raise. I don't know if any of you have read the novel by P.D. James, The Children of Men, which was made into a so-so movie. But the premise is fascinating. And it's a book that played a big development in my political thinking. She posits a world in which children are no longer born. She doesn't explain what happened, but the youngest person in the world is 21, and the novel begins. And I would say that in that world, I would be a full-blown libertarian. You can marry your sister, you can do heroin, you can sell your kidneys on eBay. It doesn't matter because nothing matters. All I ask is that I be left alone to go quietly into the night. That being said, we don't live in that world. We live in a world in which there is another generation,
in which there must be another generation. And all of these issues in which conservatives like myself get accused of trying to legislate morality or impose your values on others, I reject the framing because I think it comes from a concern with the conditions under which the next generation is brought into the world and raised. So at a more granular, particular level, how would I deal with all of these issues? My approach would be, we have a federalist system. The Constitution does not contain a right to life. It does not contain a right to marriage. Let the states decide. We are a big country. We're divided. We don't agree. Let Vermont be Vermont. Let Texas be Texas. And if Texas is tired of being Texas, well, either you move to Vermont, or through the democratic process, you transform Texas into Vermont. Why can't we allow a plurality of views on these most contentious issues, as opposed to what we do today, which is the courts eventually decide that they're going to discover in the synergies and penumbras of the Constitution various new rights and impose them on the rest of the country, oftentimes against the will of the people. I think we should have, in a way to diffuse and make our national politics more civil, adopt a more tolerant and pluralist approach when it comes to these so-called social issues that to me are really posterity issues.
Can you just take 1 second to clarify? Is that poor woman in Texas who needs an abortion, where has she to travel in your world to get that abortion?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the answer. Where does she have to travel from Texas?
I don't know, but the state of Texas, under a proper understanding of the Constitution, is perfectly within its constitutional rights to set up whatever abortion regime it wants. And it will not satisfy everyone, but when it comes to contentious issues, no one is ever going to be satisfied. So we think of this issue, what about the person whose conscience is horrified that the state allows elective late-term abortions? This is not going to be a way to keep everyone happy, but it is, by the way, the proper constitutional approach to things. There is no right to choose and there's no right to life in the Constitution, I believe.
No, I didn't want to go next, but I will. Now, this is interesting because now we've got David and me who are strong proponents of government being limited with respect to a whole range of issues, but especially in economic matters. And before I go, you have, Amitai, in your remarks about all these corporations, not really pointed to a failure of the corporations, but to a failure of law. And we see this over and over again. And I will just give you one example. And it picks up on something Judy said, and then I'll get back to the topic we're on right now. This morning in the Los Angeles Times, you will find an op-ed by two of my colleagues, he's a medical doctor, Jeff Singer, and Michael Cannon, about what's happened once contraceptives were required to be subsidized through Obamacare. We gradually from 2010, I believe, to 2012. And what's happened to the prices? They have tripled the prices of other pharmaceuticals over that period of time, which brings us to an old story, namely that when the government subsidizes these products, you will get prices exploding. We see this over and over again. So if you think that the solution is bringing government into it, rather than let markets manage these things, you haven't studied the literature on the subject that economists have shown over and over again. Now, to get back to the issue of the cultural matters, here, interestingly, David and I have some light between us. And that's the difference between a conservative and a classical liberal like me, or libertarian as we call it today. We are in favor of keeping the government out of the bedroom and the boardroom. And I agree with David, that's an unfortunate locution, but it somehow captures the imagination. The idea is that government has certain fundamental functions, and the Constitution captures this perfectly. The protection of individual rights is at the core, both with respect to threats from abroad, national defense, and law enforcement against criminals, tortfeasors, breaches of contract, and so forth domestically. And then the provision of certain public goods, as economists define them with respect to the free rider problem, namely non-rivalrous consumption, non-excludability. By that I mean this: if we have national defense as a public good, then that means that if Aaron and I are willing to pay for it, that means that David and Judy will benefit even though they don't get to pay for it. We can't exclude them from the benefit. There's non-rivalrous consumption because our enjoyment of national defense takes nothing from their enjoyment as well. These are classic public goods. They are distinguished from private goods like education, health care, retirement security. Those are goods that are not characterized by the free rider problem or by non-rivalrous consumption and non-excludability. Now, when you go beyond that, then you're providing for private goods through government, which invariably it means taking from some and giving to others. With respect to those fundamental functions of government, then anything beyond that exhibits that. And it applies every bit as much in the social realm that you're talking about. For example, we at the Cato Institute filed a brief defending Mr. Lawrence in Lawrence v. Texas, who was engaged in homosexual activities in the privacy of his own home with his partner, as against the Texas statute that criminalized that behavior. And fortunately, the Supreme Court found that behavior to be, that Texas statute to be unconstitutional. Unfortunately, conservatives were on the other side of that. I think they have come around to some extent on that issue. With respect to same-sex marriage, we filed a brief supporting that as well, primarily on the grounds that if the government is going to be involved in giving benefits to opposite-sex couples on a principle of equal protection, it can't deny those same benefits to same-sex couples. And so if you're going to recognize and provide benefits for opposite sex, you've got to do the same for same sex. There we were separated again from conservatives on that. And so I'll stop right there because that gives you a flavor of the fact that we have actually three positions up here today. We have the conservative, we have the well, maybe, yes. Well, with Amitai, we may even have six because he's on different sides of different issues. But in any event, you know, that comes with.
I want to remind you, this is a civil discussion.
Oh yes, that's right. In any event, we have conservative and classical liberal, and then we have two contemporary liberals.
I have a label.
The area of government on moral issues, social issues, is treacherous. I think it's worth quoting or referring back again to the Civil War period. The historian Shelby Foote, who wrote a monumental history of the Civil War, made one observation that I found quite arresting. Before the Civil War, people referred to the United States of America in the plural. The United States of America are. After the Civil War, they began to use the locution, the United States of America is. Now, that, given the nature of our Constitution and of our history, the separate powers for states and for the federal government, there is inevitable tension, and the founders fully anticipated that. But again, the circumstances of life in this continental country changed hugely over the years. we have moved from being a collection of separate states that got together to create a government to do certain things they couldn't do individually into a single nation. And that changes the whole environment, the interpretation that we as Americans want to give to the documents that govern the powers under which governments operate. The subject of abortion is about as hard a subject for this system to deal with as one can conceive. I am very firmly, personally, in one camp on this issue, a woman's right to choose. I'm really hard-edged on it. But I respect the fact that a very substantial proportion of my fellow Americans have a different position and think that abortion is, in certain cases, or perhaps in most, murder and should not be allowed. Views on both sides are held with deep passion and commitment. And there's no current sign that those divisions are narrowing. That puts maximum stress on the decision-making capacity in a country that is the United States of America. I think if we try to resolve that, we're going to end up just talking back and forth at each other. There are some questions to which there are no good answers. There's an old legal saying, hard cases make bad law. In this case, we have grabbed a tiger by the tail, and it's going to be with us for some time. But there are a host of other issues where getting into regulation of matters that affect our daily lives is not so fraught. And Roger raised one today, which I happened to look at, and I was struck by what I think was really shoddy scholarship rather than an illustration of a deep principle. There is a graph in the Wall Street Journal article to which he refers, which shows the steep increase of the price of contraceptive drugs starting about a decade ago, I guess it is, about the time the Affordable Care Act was passed. What isn't pointed out is that there was a huge increase in the price of other drugs that really have nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act. Think about what has happened to the price of EpiPens, of the drugs to treat diabetes, of other drugs that have been on the market for decades. This is not, the circumstances of insurance for these drugs did not change materially. Few more people got access to it. It was an instance of a change in norms for behavior by the owners of drug companies. They had market position and in some cases patents, let's remember patents, which enabled them to set prices as they wished. And indeed, in marketing new drugs, offer prices on some drugs have gone much higher than they were in the past, even though the regulatory costs associated with drug development, perhaps too high to start with, have not risen outrageously. So the example that Roger just drew, that somehow this is illustrative of how things go wrong if the government enters into, specifically through the Affordable Care Act, increasing the range of subsidies, does not, I think, prove the point that he was trying to make. What has happened is that those drugs, like a bunch of other drugs, not similarly broadened, with not similarly broadened access under insurance, at least not materially broadened access, have risen 200, 300, 400, 1,000% because of the behavior of certain drug company owners. Now, this happens to get back to the first question you raised, which is what is the role of government, or that I raised actually, I suppose, in the regulation and support of markets. This is an example where markets are not functioning well, where the very existence of insurance tends to mute the possible role of prices in regulating behavior. If we're insured, we're not exposed to the full cost, and we want insurance. So this is a case where some intervention by the collective we, in order to prevent behaviors that undermine the operation of markets, is necessary and appropriate. The point being, regulation can stifle markets, but in many cases, the proper regulation is essential to enable markets to function effectively.
No, because you've mischaracterized what I said. You've mischaracterized it.
You both got completely off target. Yeah. We talk about the cultural role of government. Judy,
it wasn't the Wall Street Journal, it was the LA Times.
I give you a chance. I stand your chance. I stand your chance. Roger, I'll give it back to you soon. But I want you to notice one thing, all of you. It's so difficult to talk about moral cultural issues. Two of my colleagues went right back to talk about prices and markets. But Judy will do better. She will take us back. She will get us back on the subject.
She'll make a brief comment on prices and markets.
Judy, there is a trapdoor behind it.
You would be, but it will be very brief. I just wanted to connect what you were just describing, Hank, in terms of pricing behavior and the relationship between insurance and cost, to what I said at the outset, which is that we have an extensive, largely private insurance, but also public insurance. But the nature of the arrangements that we've made has not created a robust mechanism for dealing with the prices services of professional hospital and physician, as well as pharmaceutical services, in that insurance mechanism. And that distinguishes us from most industrialized countries and is a tremendous problem for us. So I wanted to bring that full circle. And I guess what I will do, to not terribly brave on the cultural issues, but I will go back to what you said, David, and I would be happy to go toe-to-toe, even if there is a trapdoor under the chair, to say that my position on reproductive rights is very much about future generations, in particular about my grandchildren, my granddaughters, and my grandson. And I believe that the Constitution, it's a hell of a document, but it is a political document, as you've been describing, Hank, and our decisions as to how to interpret it and how to define the role of government is something that changes over time. And I would say that that right to reproductive rights are a fundamental right, and it is very much about keeping government out of my bedroom, and I don't mind saying so.
I promise you a chance to.
Well, I've said what I have to say. I think it was mischaracterization. My point was that the price of contraceptives before they were required to be subsidized was actually going down, and as a result of the subsidization of them, the prices have tripled those of other drugs. Now, if you want to get into the pharmaceutical areas, it is an extraordinarily complex area. I wrote a detailed study on the reimportation of drugs going into treaties and the diversification of prices in various countries, and it's much too complicated to go into here. But I think it's useful for us to note that we have here basically two different approaches to our subject. David and I are arguing essentially that there is a legal framework within which we need to discuss these questions. Whereas, if I may take the presumption to characterize Judy and Henry, there are problems that we need to address as a society, and being a democracy, the people have a right to vote to address what those problems are and what to do about them. The problem that David and I see about that position is this: we are not a democracy. Let me repeat that. We are not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. And it isn't as if the framers didn't think about these things when they drafted that Constitution and the ratifying generation ratified it, thinking of their posterity, as David said. And that's why when you look at those 18 enumerated ends or powers that are authorized to Congress, you will find nothing there about education or retirement security or daycare or national public radio, all things considered. You will find none of that. And therefore, if you want to do that, you've got to change the Constitution the right way through amending it. And if you think that David and I stand for positions that weren't thought about during the New Deal, I give you this. Rexford Tugwell, one of the principal architects of the New Deal, and I quote, "In order to get our programs through, we had to engage in tortured interpretations of a document that was intended to prevent them." So, Judy, that goes directly to your point. Yes, Rexford Tugwell, one of the principal, he was the head of the Brain Trust.
Well, it goes to the heart of our disagreement, is what it does.
Yeah, the Constitution is not an open sesame that says we can do whatever we want.
Okay, let me just, we need to turn, we have a wonderful audience, and we have time to bring them in. And let me just add two sentences. First of all, the notion, as I recall, the founding fathers also credit the Supreme Court. And one of the things the court does is keep reinterpreting the Constitution. So when some of us say the Constitution can encompass a right to choose, this is not a democratic argument, it's an argument for the courts to sort out as they did. So it's not simply a question of a majoritarian position. Second and last, when I argued that one corporation after the other are not just looking for profit, for responsible, hefty profit, but going all out for greed, to use any possible means to get profits, even if they're bending the laws. Roger, you kindly suggested it's a problem with the law. The problem is the corporations also buy the laws. So if we need to put the problem is the corporations also buy the laws.
Corporations buy the laws?
And just give one example. And when you look at the question, why vitamins, which include a very high proportion of the materials which are in the bottles of your vitamins or health supplements, are not what's written on the bottle. Many of them include risky materials. And the only reason why vitamins and other health supplements are not regulated is because two senators who got the largest contributions from the vitamin industry for the last 30 years, each year issued a law that doesn't allow the regulation of what are medically health products. We could go on for argument about that, but at the moment I'm sure we'll give a chance when you answer one of the questions to come back to that. But this is the time for you to join us. And this is microphone set up for your convenience. So if you come here and state your questions, we'll get one or two of the panels, hopefully not on every question, all the panelists.
I couldn't help but notice that the more conservative members of the panel are literally buttoned up. But I think
It's to make it easier to tell who is who.
but I think
This is because I have a French mother, and we don't dress as casually as Americans.
So it's conservative.
well, so I want to ask about how you might change the system that we have now, because what I hear a lot of the conservatives talking about is a system that no longer exists and never will exist, which is something that was designed during a time of slavery, during an agrarian society. We're not going back to that time, but I sense your frustration that the government is now trying to do a lot and in many ways is limited. It doesn't actually have the powers it needs to do those things effectively. And I hear a lot of the liberals saying the same things, just in a different way, that they actually want the government to do more, but they feel hampered by the fact that it doesn't have the power to do the things that it wants. So I'm curious how you might change the system to actually, reach the ends that you desire.
Well, I'm going to stand up for Roger. There's only one conservative on this panel. Roger is not a conservative.
He doesn't claim to be one. I also object to the characterization of the Constitution. Of course, it was designed at a time when slavery existed. It was also designed at a time when vaccines didn't exist. It was designed at a time when the combustion engine didn't exist. That has no bearing on the architecture of the Constitution. So I don't accept this premise that the Constitution is to be dismissed offhand because it failed to eliminate slavery, which predated it. There was a compromise that was involved. Anyways, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. We'll never come out alive. I already gave my answer when I first spoke, which is, I don't begin with a grand theory of what the government should do. I take the government as it exists today. And this is why I liked Henry's answer. And everyone wants to put us in separate camps. I found much to agree with what Henry said, that it's going to vary by the area. And I would first want to do a deep dive on the particular program and then offer targeted reforms to structurally move it in the right direction. And the right direction for me would be constitutional, whatever this still means today, does not undermine work and family, as I mentioned, financially sustainable. I mean, you mentioned the size of the debt, Roger. You left out the unfunded liabilities in Social Security and Medicare. I mean, by one estimation, the total debt of the U.S., if you factor in the state and local governments, is about $200 trillion, if you factor in also what they've promised to pay out to retirees. So I would want some measure of financial viability. And then I'm bored listening to my own answer because it's not a glamorous, sexy one, but I think this is what governing entails, is issue by issue, program by program. I'd want to move it in the right direction, but I don't believe in radical revolutionary change, because even if the program is broken, people are dependent on it today. And if you're going to wean them off of it, you want to do it, I think, progressively rather than dramatically. And I say this as a conservative.
I appreciated the way you framed your question, but I wanted to alter or give you my interpretation of a liberal complaint. It's not that government doesn't have the power. It is that government action is a function of politics. And what I was describing at the outset is a lot of the arrangements that we've made in the social policy arena are compromises with publicly supported private market-based action. And that compromise leads to what many social scientists refer to as hollow government. If you look at the Affordable Care Act, we farmed it out to the private sector with the intention to regulate it, right? But when you farm it out, you weaken your capacity and the political support for your ability to regulate. And that many propose compromises in that arena, it's a very dangerous ground. I believe that we've had some of these arrangements so long that I don't think we've got the political clout to throw them out. But as I said at the outset, that a standing up for the role of government to perform, to take on the collective responsibility or responsibility for us collectively I think, needs great strengthening. And I think there is some potential for that in the current political scene.
You want to join that?
No, let's say more questions.
Mr. Azirad, about your comments on vouchers for health care. I don't know how long you've been in the United States, but for most of us at open season every year, it is a complete and utter agony to try to look at all of the different policies and try to figure out which ones are the best for us. A single payer plan would eliminate agony for millions and millions of U.S. citizens.
As a Canadian citizen who has been living in this country for 15 years and is not yet a citizen, I would say that I would rather spend a week scouring the internet and talking to relatives and friends to try to pick a plan that is right for me than to have what I have in the Canadian system, which is if I want to see a specialist, I need to wait months and months. And then what we end up doing is, if you can afford it, you go into the small existing private sector we have, or you go to Vermont to go in a private clinic. I won't get into private details of what I've heard from friends and family, whereas in America, now admittedly, I get my healthcare through my employer, so I've had no difficulty accessing it. Anytime I need to go see a specialist, which thankfully is not that often, I'm still young, same week. So there is no perfect healthcare system. The demand for healthcare is unlimited because our bodies decay and we die. The supply must be limited. That's the fundamental reality of healthcare. There is no perfect system. So the only question is, who do you want to do the limitation? The bureaucrats in Ottawa or in Washington, D.C. at HHS? Or would you rather have markets take care of it, but the government has a role to play in allowing people to participate in the market if they can't, and in taking off some of the rough edges and regulating what hospitals and private health insurance companies can and cannot do? I would not pick the Canadian system or the Medicare for All system.
If, in the United States, we spend about 70% more per capita than they do in Canada. So if you want to find an explanation for why there may be queues for some services in Canada that there are not queues for in the United States, it's a spending level question. The question that was asked was about the structure of the healthcare system. And the questioner made specific reference to the difficulty of making decisions for individuals who bring to the selection problem very limited information. As it happens, this question of the quality of decisions that individuals make has been studied extensively. As it happens, surveys have been done around the world about satisfaction of citizens with the healthcare systems in their countries. The jury is in. The evidence is overwhelming. First, people are lousy evaluators of quality of health care. They need the assistance of external evaluation to guide and provide information about what works and what doesn't. They are lousy customers for health insurance. Studies indicate that every year, a sizable fraction of the population buys insurance coverage that costs them more and gives them poorer coverage than they could have had at less money. The survey evidence is in. Citizens around the world tend to approve of their healthcare systems more than do Americans of their healthcare system. And one of the most satisfied markets in, or healthcare systems in the world is the Canadian system.
And the head of the Canadian system, when he needed an operation, went to Detroit for it.
Because they spend much less, because scientific research has been active here, and we are an attraction. The best American healthcare is probably the best in the world.
No, it
but
was
if
because
you're
he
a
had a
normal
9-month
citizen,
wait.
if you are a normal citizen in a country, it is not clear that America is the best place in which to access the healthcare market. Evaluations by international health organizations consistently rank the U.S. well down the list. The leading healthcare system frequently pops up to the top is France.
No, it's because Americans kvetch more. But no,
that interest is actually an interesting comment. A British physician once said to me that Americans are the only people in the world who regard death as an option.
Yes. Well, the reason that he went to Detroit is because he didn't want to wait 9 months. You look at the number of MRIs, CAT scans in Canada per capita, it's a tiny fraction of what we have in this country. This system is so far from a free market system in America that it is the worst of both worlds. But if you think it's bad now, wait till it's free.
All right, we are done with healthcare.
Hi, all. Thank you for your comments here. Roger, I was pleased that you brought up the concepts of public goods and like externalities, since those are concepts that I think that libertarians are very often blind to. I disagree, however, with the examples that you cited. I believe you brought up education and healthcare as two areas where those were not areas that you saw public goods for, and my view would be that there are profound benefits to society to having an educated populace and a healthy populace that go beyond excludability. And so I would be curious to hear from any of the panelists about, we've talked a lot about healthcare, but on education and some of those other areas where there may be a more nebulous consensus about whether or not those can be excluded and whether or not those are truly public goods. Where do you all stand?
It's you put a very good question.
Yes, but it's not. Those are not public goods as defined by non-excludability and non-rival risk consumption. Do you understand those concepts? Well, then how is it there is a public benefit from public goods, or from private goods? That doesn't make them public goods. Lots of things have after all, if I invent a product that benefits the public, that doesn't make it a public good in the technical sense of the term. I mean, this is...
No, but perhaps what you're asking is whether their social value creates a responsibility of government acting for the collective to assure that there is equitable access to a strong quality education for everybody. So whether, however you want to define it, I think that's your question. And I would argue that there is a strong value there. And we see in education, as in healthcare, a movement for vouchers to have people choose their what school they want, as we see choose your health insurance, and that is a decidedly challenging proposition because choice and collective insurance don't go very well together.
Listen, the distinguishing feature is that you would not have true public goods because of the free rider problem. You will have education even though government doesn't provide for it. Did we not have art before the endowment for the arts was created? I believe we did, if I recall. And this is the defining factor. It's the free rider problem that I think you're not grasping with respect to extending the notion of public goods to include all manner of things that are good.
I'd like to apologize to the people that you are not grasping. Maybe they don't. And so in public goods, we talk about protecting the environment, protecting the climate, social justice, basic research, defense, vaccination. They are not automatically provided. And your question is completely appropriate. Please.
Thank you very much for taking the time and keeping things reasonably civil, I think. My name is Josiah, and I think my question falls into the line of a lot of issues you guys have been talking about and that you brought up, David, relative to posterity. I graduated college only a few years ago, and one of the big issues that our generation is seeing is, for the first time in a long time, economic mobility is at incredibly low rates, and this generation isn't guaranteed to be better off than their parents. And that's fallen precipitously from 90%, I think, in the 40s to 50%, low 50s. And I'm interested in what each of your hypotheses would be about why that is and what can be done about it. In the case of conservatives, I recognize you may reject the question because you may say this isn't the government's realm, but maybe you think that there are laws that are, or regulations that are suppressing economic mobility. I'm sure liberals would have a lot to say as well, but I'm interested in what your positions are on that issue.
Thank you. Let's take one more question, please.
Good evening. I have been listening with interest, and I heard a reference to environmental policy just in passing. And I think my question has to do with environmental, economic, and social issues. I'd like to point out that the World Economic Forum just this month issued its annual Global Risks Report, in which it ranks the perceptions of corporate leaders around the world in terms of what are the top most impactful and most likely global risks. And this year, for the first time ever, the top 5 that they ranked, and this is hundreds of corporations around the world, all have to do with climate change, extreme weather, the failure of climate action, natural disasters, and biodiversity loss. So I'm just wondering what the role of government and governments at whatever level needs to be in a world where we have what's recognized as a planetary shift in our climate and all the linked ecosystems attached. I think it affects every aspect of society.
Thank you. Climate and social mobility.
I think this is a topic where, in general terms, all 4 of us might agree. And the reason I say that is the problem you describe is a classic tragedy of the commons situation. The world is a resource that is scarce, vast but scarce. When each of us uses some of it or damages it in some way, we inflict externalities. And that, I think, is an area where all of us agree that there is a role for collective intervention. The practical question is how. The first challenge is to recognize that there's a problem, which not everybody has done, but I'm going to assume that the 4 of us up here all agree on that. And I think there might be substantial agreement on one of the most powerful instruments for dealing with that, which is to use the market economy by taxing carbon. This is a policy instrument that has been embraced by economists right across the political spectrum, right, left, and center. It is being used in a limited way, and I believe that at some point in the not-too-distant future, it's likely to be implemented here in the United States. The disagreements come when you get, well, there are just some disagreements on that particular policy, but at least in my fraternity, the economics fraternity, which I hope will become an economic sorority as well in the future, I think there's overwhelming agreement on that. The next step, though, is what else do you do? If you tax carbon, you hurt some people. What steps should be taken collectively to bail them out, to help them so they don't get hurt? How much investment should be publicly sponsored to develop new technologies to use energy more effectively and produce it in a less dirty fashion? That's where the disagreements occur. They're real and they're important, but I think with respect to the problem in general, I hope we would all agree this is one area where government does have a role, We would disagree, I think, on exactly how to do that, but there would be substantial overlap.
So we're getting into the last 10 minutes of our evening. So I need one of you to talk about economic mobility. David.
You asked an immensely complicated question, so I can't give you a comprehensive answer.
I would give you two buckets to think about it. One would be, what is it that you want to give a child or the next generation? The skills, the virtues, the knowledge, and are we delivering that? And second, to what extent are the desirable positions in life in America allocated on the basis of merit, or is the game rigged in one way or another? And I see pretty serious deficiencies in both realms, although it affects Americans of different socioeconomic groups very differently. As a rule of thumb, if your parents went to college, they are likely instilling in you bourgeois virtues that regrettably the culture at large is not preaching. So the recipe to success, to a decent middle-class life is, as my father, whose command of the English language is so-so, would say, it's not rocket surgery. You want to, obey the law, study, work, avoid drugs, cultivate the virtues you need to get ahead in a commercial republic. The elites do that quite well. They behave a certain way. The culture doesn't preach that. The culture preaches the ethos, the liberationist ethos of the 1960s, and the people who pay the price the most, it seems to me, are Americans in lower socioeconomic groups, where you see that work, family, community, law-abidingness, the kinds of drugs that are consumed, it's not the occasional joint with your friends, it's harder drugs, are having devastating consequences on the ability of children to accumulate the wonky term in DC is social capital. I mean, DC has a knack for making everything boring. I mean, basically the skills and the virtues that you need to get ahead. And then when I look at the system, take the example of the universities. In France, the admissions process is meritocratic. No one cares whether your parents went there. No one cares whether your grandparents donated money. No one cares whether you row, you're black, you're gay, you're fourth generation, sixth generation. They care about your test scores. It's the same thing, by the way, in China. In America, not so. So we have an admission system for the universities that treats different people differently based on their skin color, whether their parents went there, do they donate, are they participating in sports? And I don't think it's fair. And then you look at the workplace, this is something that Roger can probably talk about a little bit more, the number of bogus licensing requirements we have in America. I don't mean at the high level, like brain surgery or building rockets. I mean cutting hair, being in interior decorating, driving a taxi, which is being put out of business by Uber. Why the cumbersome licenses that create barriers to entry and deny someone with rudimentary skills the ability to earn a decent living? Because those who currently exercise the profession form a cartel, leverage the power of the state to impose these licensing requirements to keep out the competition. So I don't want to do away with all licensing requirements, but I would want to open things up to newcomers. And I think that if you look at the various realms of American life, the educational system, the workplace, you'll see that there are several barriers to entry that tend to privilege established players or those whose parents participated in these institutions rather than newcomers.
Let me start by agreeing with the statements you just made about the over-licensing in the United States. I think that's exactly right. I'd like to suggest there are two kinds of inequality, and they're different, and they elicit different solutions and, I think, reactions from each of us. On the one hand, there's the newly generated inequality, the evolution of what is sometimes called the winner-take-all society, the fabulous compensation paid to a very small fraction of people in each of various fields. The other kind of inequality is the inequality that is inherited. It can be characterized in some degree as, yes, being born into a situation where you lack not just human, but also financial capital. It's a legacy of past discrimination in this country. In both areas, I think there is a collective role. One cannot be blind to the lingering, serious consequences of the misdeeds of our forebears, affecting various minority groups. And while we are perhaps not directly responsible for those acts, I think as a collectivity, we have an obligation to do something to counter them when they affect people who are born now. The other area of inequality is the generation of rampantly different levels of compensation. We may disagree about whether that is a problem, but a lot of people think it is a problem. That with huge concentrations of wealth come huge differences in political power, that welfare could be enhanced and incentives maintained if the differences in incomes and wealth were narrowed, not eliminated, but narrowed. And that, too, is an area where taxation and transfer policy of government has a role to play. And for my last remark, I have to refer back to Social Security. It's one reason why I think that program is one of the triumphs of American legislation, and I will assert and am willing to prove to anyone we can afford the current system. It faces a financial shortfall. Closing that shortfall is easy. It would take about 1% of GDP, either reductions in benefits or increases in revenues, to put Social Security on sound financial footing for the foreseeable future, what the actuaries call sustainable solvency, and we ought to do it.
Please, I'll try and make it brief and quick. Getting back to the question of regulation from a general standpoint, considering human nature, greed and avarice, considering historical precedents, the trust busters of the last century, and what I always think of is from the man on the street, why was it regulated in the first place? That is to say, people who play any competitive sports, there are always regulations, there are rules to the game. People always try to game those rules, and they cheat. Baseball, football, the Patriots, Houston. The question is, when we look at Boeing, when we look at the USDA allowing the meat packing people to inspect their own meat as they speed up the line, and drug companies to make to disperse opioids in enormous amounts to people who really shouldn't have them. How many people have to be harmed before we believe that regulation needs to be reinstituted in certain industries to protect people? I mean, the hundreds of people that were killed by Boeing, the instances or the examples of them are numerous, but we always hear, or we continue to hear about the market regulating itself, laissez-faire economics, that it will take care of itself, but it never really seems to do that. How bad does it have to get before we turn the corner and start to put rules into place and regulate the game so that it doesn't hurt the populace?
Well put.
Hi, my topic follow-up is this question of cultural issues. And I was interested, David, by your comment of protecting liberty and going back to whose liberty the Constitution was meant to protect. It was white male landowners. And so it seems to me that a lot of the cultural issues are in fact the extension of liberties to those populations that didn't accord it earlier. And it's always a fight because those who have the liberties don't actually want to extend them to others.
Can you remind me where in the Constitution the words white and male and landowner appear? Because I don't recall where they are.
Those were the only people putting that together.
Really, but I'm asking you.
Yeah, it feels like you're baiting me. But the fact is that it was made by white landowner males.
Yeah, the fact is that the language of the text is colorblind and sex blind. I don't know why you're laughing. It is. As a matter of fact, the words slavery do not appear there. The words black don't appear there. It 3/5 of other persons. It does not say 3/5 of black people. It's a euphemism to deal with the contentious question of representation in Congress. The southern states wanted to count their slaves as one to inflate their representation in Congress. The northern states said, so you dehumanize them by treating them like chattel, and suddenly when it comes to allocating members of the House, you want to count them as one? They compromised and they settled on 3/5. My point is, the practices at the time of the founding were shameful in certain regards, most clearly when it comes to race. It is not true that our founding documents and our founding principles themselves are tainted. So I use the Constitution, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, to condemn the injustices rather than to dismiss the entirety of the founding. They could have so easily written the Confederate Constitution. If you want to see what a racist constitution looks like, go read the Confederate Constitution. It's basically the plagiarized US Constitution, replete with references protecting slavery. The founders were quite conscious to lay down principles that regrettably they could not actualize at the time, but the principles themselves that we hold dear are, as a matter of fact, colorblind and sex blind.
Okay.
I agree entirely with what David just said. Now to go back to the first question, we are overburdened with regulations from one end to the other, many of them counterproductive, many of them the reflection of the influence of special interests. The issue with Boeing, for example, is not the absence of regulation, it's that the regulators didn't do their job. Let's admit that. And we see over and over again this. Take, for example, the economic decline of 2007 and 2008. That was not brought about by greedy Wall Street. That was brought about by something called the Community Reinvestment Act, which encouraged banks to lend money to people who manifestly were in no financial position to pay it back. And it guaranteed those banks that once those properties failed, they would be subsidized by the government. So the problem was right there in the government. It wasn't in the absence of regulations, it was in the failure of government either to have smart regulations or to enforce the smart regulations that were there.
Judy, you have the last words. You can inhale first and then.
Yes, I'm going to think. I'm going to use them carefully. First of all, I want to thank you for raising that point. And whatever the words, whatever the specifics of the Constitution, it was written to protect the white propertied classes. I don't think I don't think there's any question about that. And what it takes me back to much of our discussion, even the most recent comments, is the importance of politics. And what you're describing is the hollow government that I was talking about, and what you're talking about is the capacity of certain groups that's come up in more than one comment, the capacity of some, the better off and moneyed interests and what have you, to exert greater influence to the detriment of many, many, many others. Our political system right now is sorely challenged, and there's a lot of discussion about whether our existing rules, they were good, the founders, but we don't even have the founder system anymore. But there are a lot of concerns about our not being a democracy because of the political institutions that we have. But whether our ability to address that is going to be a function of how we mobilize and vote in the upcoming and future elections. And we may not be able to, we will always have contentious issues, but we can do a hell of a lot better than we're doing now. So I would use my last words to say for people, I am now only talking to people who agree with me. Get out and vote early, vote often, and vote effectively. So.
Before I ask you to help me thank the panel for what was a very spirited and enlightening discussion, I'd like to invite you all back to join us on March 2nd, right here, where we're going to be discussing if less is more. If not, the time has come to bring back the counterculture for those who are privileged. If the environment or what makes for good life calls for re-examination of if acquiring ever more goods is even making good life, or if there comes a level after our basic needs are satisfied, where other pursuits, like spending time with family, public service and such, are more fulfilling and less harmful to the environment. So please, I hope to see you on March 2nd. And now please help me thank the panel.